possibly cannot start by saying, Mr. Chairman. So let me address someone we all respect very deeply, with whom, as Salim mentioned, it's always a privilege to share the podium, Mr. Said Zaman. He really is the motive force behind. He basically drives the process and takes initiative, and we merely help and support him every year to be able to launch this report from Dhaka. I have just been reminded that we haven't opened the floor to questions. So I'm going to make just a half statement, and then I think I will go back to my chair and we will have some question and answers, and then maybe make a few concluding remarks. It's a pity that Professor Subhan could not join us. He did apologize to me. He just couldn't help it. A meeting has been called where he's absolutely required. So we don't have the benefit of his expansive knowledge on the subject, nor his wisdom. This is a huge loss for us today. And I have absolutely no intention of trying to take a foray into the content of the report as such, but just to make a few observations. If one goes back to the classics in economics, it's quite obvious that the center of their query and their investigation was the human being, the welfare of the human being, the welfare of society. And beginning with the later classics and then the neoclassics in economics, economics became more and more technical, more and more dense, more and more abstract, as we borrowed from the physical sciences, and as we, I feel, more and more deluded ourselves that we could use or we could borrow the principles of the modern scientific method to its very last letter and use it in a behavioral science. And I think that didn't work too well for us. And slowly, I think we moved away from that central focus on the well-being of human beings. GDP as a measure of human well-being has always known to be less than perfect. Even when it was first actually put forward, it was very well known that it is not a good enough measure. But I think the reason that it has been so popular and continues to be used with such popularity despite everything else is because it is an extremely convenient measure. Secondly, because it appears for long periods in the history of the market economy that along with GDP, all the other dimensions that we could think of at the time of human well-being, that they seem to be positively correlated. That, in other words, that the GDP could be a reasonable proxy for measuring well-being. Now, obviously there is huge debate on this issue, and I don't want to again sort of detract into that area too much, except to say that the GDP is also an extremely convenient measure to have. It is a very powerful abstraction because you can get rid of a lot of things just by taking one number and representing that one number to suggest many different things. Unfortunately, as Salim reminds us very powerfully, I think it is not a good enough measure. And the HDI that came from Dr. Mahbub essentially was indeed a very powerful restatement of what constitutes human welfare, what constitutes the centrality of economics as a social science. I have broadened the context a little bit, but to me that's really what it means. He challenged the existing paradigm, and it has really, I think, changed the entire debate, and once again it has brought back into focus what it means for countries which are developing also to be human. And a lot of progress has been made in this regard. Salim talked about the inclusive growth, dimensions of he believes HDI is reflective of, can be achieved through inclusive growth, and basically that they are synonymous. And Mr. Hafeez Rahman explained to us something that Dr. Mahbub had initially suggested, that there is a two-way link between growth and human well-being. All of that, I think, is extremely important to keep, within, well within our context. As I raise another issue, which is that in the 80s, in the early 80s, there emerged the so-called Washington Consensus, and as the Washington Consensus emerged, there was, in my view, again, this resurgence of the focus on growth, the focus on macroeconomic stability, and it was a rather narrow focus. Once again, I think major mistakes were made because in public policy, in the pursuit of development, because the focus was simply the increase of GDP and the belief that the rest of it would follow. This has been alluded to, Salim also spoke about it, but I have to remember Sir John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous economist at this point, who described this sort of logic that growth automatically leads to the trickle-down effect. In other words, his description of it was the horse and sparrow economics. It was a very sarcastic comment, but a brilliant comment in the sense that what he meant by horse and sparrow economics is that you have a few huge players in the economy, like the horse. You feed the horse, and then the horse does what it is supposed to. It digests its meal, and then the sparrows come along and they feed on what the horse has to basically excrete. So then the little sparrows also sort of become a little bigger, but they can't become a whole lot bigger. So that is the story of the trickle-down theory. The reason that I say that I raise this here is that all of these things were actually, this debate has been a long one for those who have studied development and economics. They understand this debate, they are aware of this debate as to whether growth alone is enough, the tension between growth and income distribution, the tension between growth and human development, and numbers were shared by Salim to suggest that a doubling of the GDP does not mean a doubling of human welfare or well-being. So essentially, I feel now that we have entered another period in which, while the reaction to, if you like, to this whole idea that growth alone is enough, we take care of growth, the rest follows, this, although it had a resurgence with the Washington Consensus, it has again been challenged. This time we got the entire MDG paradigm. In other words, that you cannot simply by stating one or two particular variables or symbols, or by accounting for material progress alone, you cannot represent welfare in society. So what then becomes the narrative? You have the Human Development Index, you have the growth enthusiasts who actually continue to thrive to date, and then you have the Washington Consensus, and come the year 2000, you got at the Millennium Summit, the world's leaders launched the MDGs. The biggest contribution of the MDGs was that it took the focus away from narrow economic targets, and it has brought a much wider range of issues and turned something which was much more abstract. Economists like to use models. They moved away from all those things into now looking at a narrative. In other words, you cannot explain, you cannot try to tackle issues and challenges of development and growth without actually addressing it through some sort of a narrative. Anything less than a narrative is just not enough to be able to deal with the entire challenge of structural transformation of societies. And from there we have moved on. There's been great fanfare in recent weeks, and we now have the SDGs. And I think very importantly on the question of whether we actually overconsume in the present day and take away resources from the future, live extremely well today, materially speaking, and then leave future generations to be not just not so well off, but also we leave an endangered planet. This, I think, now is really the biggest challenge facing development theory and practice. So we have to be able to embrace the SDGs. We have to be able to get much greater public action behind the SDGs, which means both the government and its political machinery the political leaders of the country and civil society, extremely importantly, must be active in the pursuit of the SDGs. There is absolutely no point in becoming a high middle income country or a high income country and have a country where you cannot breathe, a country where you cannot touch the water because you're going to get infected. Your rivers are dry, you have a desertification process ongoing. Many doubt that within 30 years we will not have the rivers that we have today. So, and without our rivers, this is not a land that can sustain. This delta cannot sustain without its rivers. So I am just here basically to remind all ourselves that we have a huge new dimension which has opened up, for some time now. But I think now, much more than at any time in the past, there is widespread acceptance of the fact that we live in an endangered planet. The activities of our arrogance as human beings, that we could do whatever we wanted to do with our natural resources, that we in our arrogance could tame the forces of nature in order to essentially provide us better material conditions, that in the process, over this century in particular, we have severely undermined the future of human society as a whole. This is not an acceptable situation. We need strong policy action on this front. I use this opportunity. It is not necessarily something to do with today's launch, but I took this opportunity to take a broad sweep at what has happened to economics as a science, because it underpins development theory to a large extent, and also to make a public confession that we were wrong in many ways, but that we ignored other disciplines in our pursuit of actually trying to lead development. So corrections, I think, need to be made.